Right. Now, as the learning outcome states, it basically talks about how do we understand the impact of events, on tourism. Now, I was reading an interesting article. This was, I would say, just about a couple of minutes ago, just to understand and get some slides together to make them up to date. I did understand that one of the key things which came to my knowledge was that I thought that tourism as a term would have been formed a couple of years back, or is quite an old term which we use in the context of travel, tourism, and hospitality industry. So what I found something interesting was that this term, event tourism, when we look at tourism, events, and hospitality, all the three sectors together, and we look at specifically the term which is called event tourism. So tourist activity, or people traveling primarily for the reasons of attending an event. As we discussed last time, the four big type of events which typically are crowned as a, known possibly as an acronym, are MICE, meetings, incentives, we look at conferences and exhibitions. So when people primarily travel, for the purposes of attending events or large events or meetings, conferences, and exhibitions, that term is primarily called, or there's a specific term which is called event tourism. And this term was essentially only coined in the 1980s. And obviously, this creates a direct link between when we look at studying events, and we also look at the tourism and hospitality sector as a whole. Now, the other thing which I also found was with regards to that, and this is something that we've discussed, that events are quite a significant part of, the tourism and hospitality sector, because over the decades wherein this sector has slowly and steadily emerged, what we've seen is that the sector has become obviously the fourth largest exporter of, products in terms of, when I say tourist products or tourism activities in the world. So this, because it employs a lot of people, it also is one of the largest sectors. When I say one of the largest, it's probably the largest sector, as far as outside defense is concerned, but it is one of the largest services sector in the world, which employs a lot of people. What we've seen is that over the years, there are lots of concepts which have been, created and which have emerged because of human activity, and these then tend to significantly contribute towards the tourism and hospitality industry in terms of activities. So event is one key such factor, and within events, over the years, what we've seen is the emergence of MICE as a concept, which then led to the creation of this term called event tourism. And there are some good reading which can be done, and I'll primarily send this across as a bit of a handout and give you some more background in terms of why events have become important, how it links into the tourism activity, and then why some companies and businesses specifically focus just on events management as a business within the tourism and hospitality sector. So sometimes we get to hear that I have a couple of friends coming over, or I have a small business coming over from Europe for about a week or so to the UK to come in and attend a conference, and obviously they will do a bit of sightseeing. Now this is a very small activity which some of the businesses put across, but this is basically event tourism. So they are coming over, some delegates are coming over to attend maybe a conference or a seminar which will be 2 or 3 days, or a training event, and then after that, because they're coming over, the company would say, okay, you guys are going over for 3 nights, 4 days, it's best that, okay, you extend it. And sometimes what they say is you can go around and obviously, also see the city, explore the market for business, or, a bit of networking. And that concept tends to be a very simple example of something called, event tourism. And this is what we see when we discussed about, the Mobile World Congress, MWC in particular, for Barcelona and FIRA, which happens, and that has become a calendar event, which is an event which primarily looks at event tourism. So a lot of visitors go and say, okay, I will go and attend Mobile World Congress. Sometimes you will see a lot of job agencies go along to the event, and the whole idea of they going there is to basically network. But what it then tends to do is turn into something called an event tourism, because the event is not primarily for the jobs industry, but because most of the senior executives and key people making the decision in HR, hiring, selection, recruitment are there, it makes sense for the job industry or, the recruitment consultants to be there as well. And for them, it turns out to be a bit of an event tourism. But over the years, the activity has got integrated, and then, it is a part and parcel of how this event is done. And, they have a separate section wherein a lot of senior executives, a lot of people come in and, meet these consultants and, obviously recruitment companies. So what we've done so far is we've understood why events, have become important, how much contribution they have towards, in general, when we looked at that infograph to understand, especially how big that industry is within the UK. We also understood the, connection between the three different types of terms and why they are so interdependent today. And then in the last, what we're looking at today is primarily to understand, after that, we also understood the big contributors to the event revenue generation, which is MICE, and then the types of events, how they are classified, how they happen, when they happen, what are the reasons behind it. And then today what we're looking at is understanding, the last outcome, which is primarily understanding what are the impacts of event tourism in particular. So things which happen primarily on the pretext of being organized as an event, but lead to tourist activities. So what we want to be able to do is, in this outcome, we want to understand what are the range of impacts which event in particular can have on a tourist destination. So in particular, I will discuss, things like looking at, the waste management, the kind of waste it produces, zero footprint in some cases, carbon emissions, sustainable. So primarily sustainability as a topic will be discussed. And then the other bit that we will look at is what are the positive and what are the negative impacts, which events have, on a particular destination. And these would be to look at focusing on understanding, breaking them into 3 or 4 different types to clearly understand the positive as well as the negative impacts. So very briefly, let's look at going through some slides. And the idea here of going through some slides would be to try and understand, some theoretical concepts and, the key areas behind this particular topic. And at some stage, what we will do is, get into the tasks toward the end. Now, if you have any questions, anything that you do not understand, please feel free to stop me there and ask me questions, so that what we can do is we can obviously look at, taking up those queries. And then if required, I will send some additional handouts, towards the end of the session for you to grasp a bit more on the theory and the theoretical concepts. So let's look at some of these, which is to understand. One second. I think I think the sound had disappeared. Are you able to hear me now? Yep, you're back. Great. So you able to hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay. So the last bit, just to recap, what I was saying was basically in the task that we discussed, what we'll do is we'll basically look at understanding what are the various impacts the events and event management as a concept within the THM sector has. And then towards the end, what we'll do is we'll discuss a few factors in terms of classifying them in terms of impact, and also looking at the positive and the negative outcomes which events have primarily, when they are held in a particular city or in a particular location. Now, the idea would be to go through some of the slides. If you have any queries, any questions, please feel free to ask me there and then. And then if required, in order to give some more details on concepts, I can send across a handout which I've already prepared on this learning outcome just after the session. So let's understand and go through some of the slides. Now, what we want to be able to look at is, in this learning outcome, we are looking at focusing on something which is given in the indicative content, and that talks about sustainability and event management, the role of sustainability and why some of these events, when they happen, what kind of output they generate in terms of, emissions, carbon footprint, waste management, and, things like that. So over the years, because this has become a very, very key area, operations in particular within the events, management is a key area, because what they tend to do is when you look at doing an event, if we understand and try and visualize how the events typically happen, there might be a calendar for the year in which it's a significant, say for example, significant event which is going to happen. There's a lot of planning which goes into it, and the organizers would then, allocate stalls, or for example, take up a particular venue. The stalls are then allocated, or spaces are allocated, and once they are done, the different companies, some of them, if they are small businesses or individuals participating, will kind of tend to manage and project manage everything themselves to create a presence. But large companies would come in and create props, structures, and then the whole event operation side of things starts to come in, wherein it becomes a buzzing place for a couple of days, and then you have lots of inflow of visitors, security, all those things are maintained. Now, when this kind of a thing happens, what we do see is that such an event, whether it's big or small, but in general, to understand the concept, concentrating on something like big events, they are able to generate a lot of footfalls in a very short amount of time. And that then leads to the creation of high levels of waste and, say, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. A simple example is, if you have an event, you cannot have an event without having, say, for example, fire and safety or health and safety being in that location. You have the facilities of the toilets or the washrooms. Then you also have a small makeshift, kind of a place wherein medical aid could be provided. And then you have a lot of people within the security side of things to make sure that the events go as planned and there are no untoward elements which kind of help in or which kind of have the intention of disrupting the event. So when you look at that, operation planning and events management kind of become a role within themselves, and planning has to be done in the most effective way so that it minimizes causes of any incidents which could happen because of security lapses, but also at the same point in time, they have to look at efficient management of waste and also look at the place being restored to the original condition when it is handed back to the council, or for example, handed back to the authorities. So here in this case, over the years, a lot of mandatory regulation has come in, and that mandatory regulation, when it has come in, is kind of started to propose certain legislations for event management companies and companies which are involved in the operations of event management, in order to minimize wastage and also to try and promote the concept of something called sustainable event management. Now, from my point of view, if an activity has to be thought of, when you look at a large event like a Grand Prix, for example, we have the Silverstone Grand Prix which happens here. You look at a lot of Grand Prix, there are about 24 of them which happen across the year. There are lots of people which come in and visit and go for watching the event. But what you see is there's a large footprint which gets created in terms of carbon house emissions, because the cars and the engines and everything is running, for straight 2 hours, 2.5, 3 hours. And they do, I think in Silverstone is about 44 laps is what most drivers do before they come to the, conclusion in terms of who's won the race and all. So there's a lot of waste which gets created. It's not just in the form of carbon emissions, but in terms of rubber, tires. If there's a serious incident, then obviously, the things which get involved. And that, when it caters to this particular event, in terms of the Grand Prix racing, you will see that that event and that venue itself has been over the years designed to take care of, waste management. That means once the event is over, everything goes back to normal. The event, the place is open to visitors, tourists. They can come in. Sometimes it's open across the year to public, wherein they can bring across their own, cars under insurance. They can drive the cars on the track and things like that. So there are lots of things which the event venue tries to do in terms of creating business, but at the end of the day, they are responsible for ensuring that they have minimum footprint in terms of waste and carbon gas, greenhouse gas emissions or carbon gas emissions as far as that is concerned. So I think the point there is to understand that when such kind of events become calendar events and they happen year on year, then the concept of something called the sustainable event practices or management actually comes into place. So here the idea is that though the event is primarily showcasing the efficiency of the engine, or the manufacturers like Renault, Mercedes, Ferrari, which produce the best cars in the world, and they want to kind of exhibit that our engines and our cars have the best fuel mileage, efficiency, and durability. That is why some of these championship are actually supported by sponsorships from large manufacturers, which are primarily car manufacturers. But there, the whole idea which the legislation is trying to bring in is to say that some of these do contribute towards global warming or carbon house gas emissions, and there is a corporate responsibility which is behind it, and that's where the concept of the impact on the concept of what you call the impact concept of, for example, sustainable management comes in, and the impact of that particular event actually has to be measured in terms of what it has for that particular location. Silverstone is primarily a venue which primarily hosts, for example, the Grand Prix once a year, but there might be a number of other events which happen at small scale or low scale events during the course of the year at the racing ring. But in general, I think the key concept which now gets promoted when you have tourism coming in primarily on the basis of event tourism coming in is to ensure that some of these things are minimized, and things which are developed at these venues are reusable over a long term in terms of to ensure environmental sustainability. Now, the other things that we do see that some of the events when we look at, for example, which happen elsewhere in location, they also generate what you call a lot of environmental waste. And the other day I'd taken the example of the Glastonbury Festival, the music festival which tends to happen, and it's quite popular. Every year we see about hundreds of thousands, not hundreds, but maybe tens of thousands of people attending that event and the festival. What it tends to do is it tends to generate a lot of waste. And essentially, when we look at waste management, because it happens in a particular location, you tend to have agencies which tend to manage and make sure that the waste is processed and it's not left there once the event gets over. So it is the environment in general where the event is happening, is kind of restored back to its original settings before they end up leaving as event organizers. So you will see that the creation of don't know the exact word, but I think the creation of, say, for example, a lot of people bring their tents and things like that to participate. But the facilities around that, when they look at water facilities, the toilet facilities, waste disposal facilities, they create those so that it's easy for them to kind of do away and dispose and recycle that waste during the course of the event when it happens, and also at a later stage when the event is over. Now, what we also want to look at is because these events bring in a lot of visitors at any given point in time, and then obviously this is all related to revenue. So when you look at revenue, sometimes when we look at talking about, there is a term when we talk about which is called the, I think, triple bottom line. Now the triple bottom line essentially, refers to in the case of tourism. It's basically a combination of three terms, and this basically looks at a framework wherein everything in the event management from a point of view of the organizers, they tend to define the concept and relate it to the financial viability and the outcome of the event. So what they tend to say is the concept is basically based on bringing across a large amount of revenue, large number of people to this location, and what it will tend to generate is a great amount of business. But the triple bottom line as a concept now also includes the social and environmental responsibilities which these companies have to bear if they are to look at creating those events in such locations, which are locations of, which are public locations owned by the government, and so that these locations are restored back to the original condition before and after they leave the location in terms of the event. So triple bottom line is a word which has been borrowed from the accounting framework, but over the years, this is a term which has become quite synonymous within the tourism and hospitality sector, and in context and in relation to something called events management, because what most event organizers do is when they try and create and go down to the drawing board and sit down and start kind of planning an event, creating an event, deciding the objectives, what they tend to do is the first rationale that they have in mind is in terms of the financial bottom line, which is basically the revenue the event or the activity would generate. And in relation to that, over the years, what they've said is that if you have to do this time and again and make this a regular event in the yearly calendar, then we have to look at the social and also the environmental responsibilities in order for us to be able to run this as an event and have permission to run this as an event, from the council, the government. And this is where it kind of focuses on something called the triple bottom line. So the financial impact, social, as well as the environmental impact. So let's look at understanding on this particular slide, just the benefits of sustainable event, event practices. Now, some of the events that we do or are planned by the agencies, they typically look at, addressing some expectations in the wider community. Now, what does that mean? Now, you will see that sometimes some countries, some cities are just tourist destinations, but you will see that given a chance, sometimes there is a referendum or a voting which tends to take place within the communities and the city to say that do you want this kind of a big event to come to the city or not. Most people living in that location understand that, okay, this is going to be beneficial economically, but sometimes they look at the wider impact of the social as well as the environmental, impact. And sometimes you will see the cities do turn down, the event on the basis of, the merits that they see that it won't be able to generate, which is related to social and economic or environmental responsibilities. So if you see a lot of cities which had bid for the 2026 Olympics, I think the 2024 Olympics after the one which is happening in Japan, there were 2 or 3 cities which actually withdrew the bid, and they withdrew the bid because the mayors or obviously the wider community in that city did feel that obviously that will bring the event itself will bring a kind of a significant economic investment and obviously a boost to the economy, but in the long run, the social and environmental effects of that event or that particular large event happening in that city will not be felt in the wider community. So in that case, what they do is, because the expectations are not met, what they do not see is that this is going to bring in the advantages or the economic benefits. Sometimes you will see that the communities will withdraw from having to host such events or allowing, say, the city mayor or the government authorities to kind of participate and bring that event over to the city. Now, in terms of long-term effects or long-term benefits that we look at, most events would look at reducing greenhouse emissions, because there's a lot of usage of fossil fuels, lots of things which are required in terms of electricity, which is primarily used because the event requires air conditioning, for example. Most of the events, are within the indoor venues, and because of the electricity and air conditioning required, there's a lot of, emissions which kind of tend to offset what we see is greenhouse gas emissions. Now, one of the other things that you also notice is that sometimes, these events are marketed from a point of view of, getting sponsorships and promotions as well. And this would mean that large, consumer brands come in and obviously sponsor the events, and that tends to bring in a lot of investment into the city. Now, that might be seen as an immediate impact, but the long-term, impact or the benefit of that would be that sometimes vendors associate with these events to see that it will help them in brand building and obviously, getting in more customers, or in this case, attendees coming to the event. Sometimes when large, we took the example of, the football matches which tend to happen in Wembley, or when we look at, the finals which tend to happen, what we do see is that there are what you call vendors or companies, large corporate organizations which tend to sponsor, the venue. So in this case, we look at, so I'll probably take, the example of, the ATHE Stadium in Manchester. What we do see is that's a city, ground, which is Manchester City ground, but there's a company which does see benefit, and what they've done is the ATHE Airlines have come in and, kind of taken the branding and sponsored the venue, and that has kind of said, okay, it's given them the branding, and, obviously they feel that it will help them build in a positive image in front of the fans and obviously the supporters, and they tend to see that maybe that will be an increase in the business that they get over the years. And I think I took the example of the venue, which is NEC in Birmingham, and that has been branded by the Japanese company, and obviously it's now known synonymous to being the NEC venue, which is very popular for events and exhibition. So we tend to see some long-term benefits, we tend to see some immediate benefits, and in terms of when we look at sustainable practices, the last 3 points, which we discuss is, I think most venues and most cities put emphasis on something like diverting recycling. That means they want most of the material to be made available during the location, during the duration of the event at the location, needs to be recycled, and it needs to be something which can be, recycled in terms of going into the waste going into the landfill. They also look at, building in the cost. There's a tax which you normally see, which gets, installed on such events and large organizers when they do the events in the city. And that tax is basically levied as a levy by the government in most cases, and that tends to go into, look at waste removal and, obviously ensuring that, whatever is recyclable can go across to the landfills. And then you will see sometimes when you go and attend large exhibitions like these, when you get the welcome pack or you get some sort of a badge and or a visitor's pass, you will normally see that there's an appeal printed on, on the back of it that, to help promote recycling, please do away with this card in a secure way, or, return the card for it to be made reusable. And that appeals to, the corporate social responsibility aspect, for organizations, but also, the moral aspect, which they would expect people to be able to support when they look at, the concept of sustainable practices. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. Now, a couple of other slides which basically talk about, say, in a bit more detail, and talks about, even waste management plan. So when you look at an event team essentially working, or organizers of the event essentially working to put together an event, there is a very specific team which gets to work on something, or, to look at, they're a part of the planning team essentially, but that team sits separately as an important set of individuals working within that team, and they manage something called the waste management, or the waste materials which are basically produced, by I would say hundreds of thousands of agencies which work in a particular location when they create props, venues, designs, stages, things like that. And that responsibility of that team is to basically look at managing waste and then creating plans which are basically related to waste management. And what they tend to do is they tend to create waste management plans. And a simple example would be that you will normally see that when the event venue gets ready, or they are in the process of installing and creating all these at the event venue, you will see the installation of large skips, dumpers or tippers, which will basically take away the waste, because that cannot be dumped in that location. And some of that waste, what they do is they kind of itemize the skips in terms of furniture waste, plastic waste, construction waste, things like that, because their idea is to basically look at, ensuring that whatever waste is being produced can be recycled, and it, can be done away with very safely. At the same point in time, ensuring that the carbon footprint that whole event has, as a responsibility, is minimized, with regards to some of the key aspects that they have to meet from a point of view of legislation. So here, waste management plans, typically look at these key steps. They include, obtaining support from key stakeholders, which would mean that they will have permissions from the government, the local authority. Obviously, once the stands and props and other things have been made, there's a central team which goes and does the inspections to see that the material which has been used as per the prescribed, materials, so that once the event is over and this needs to be dismantled, and if the event organizer or the company is to leave everything back, then the material used in that location can be easily recycled by the event organizers. And then they look at, obviously establishing responsibility, who will manage what kind of recycling will be done. And this then tends to create tie-ups with the local authorities, the government, so that, there is an additional payment if required to be paid. Then waste management in terms of, the food waste management typically happens on a daily basis, the bins are clean, things like that. Those are all part of the waste management plan, which that team takes over when they are looking at doing large events in a particular venue. And their whole strategy is to look at reducing the amount of waste being produced at that location and ensuring that most of the waste being produced is either compostable or is recyclable and consists of materials being used at the venue, at the location, which tend to be recyclable. And then, the basic aspects of collection, storage, sorting, disposal, things like that, they tend to work, with the local authorities in the local government or maybe the councils in that location, depending on the city and the country, in order for them to be able to dispose of the rubbish in the most, reasonable way, so that this can be then leading to recycling. Now, sometimes you will see, this is an expansion of the same slide, sometimes you will see that most advertisers or, most, let's say most events, when they are basically happening, what they tend to do is when the companies in those events, they tend to also kind of give them some sort of instructions or guidelines at the very beginning in terms of how you can utilize the location, what kind of material which can be used. And at some stage, if you have to do away with it, then you have to look at paying some charges for disposal of that material as well. Now, I took the example of a company called Pico, which primarily, was in the concept of something called the PCO, and they are able to, not just start from scratch by giving you designs, constructs, but they can deliver the whole sets, the venues, and also, look at managing the event, by providing you staff and other operational staff in terms of managing the event. Now, these kind of agencies, when they provide you a quotation or, they provide you a quote, primarily for, creating booths in the exhibition, creating stands, and display stands and other kind of props within the events. What they do is they basically give you a clear breakdown in terms of cost, and one breakdown in terms of cost is something which is primarily for recycling. That means if you decide that you're going to retain them as an agency to do the event early next year as well and use the same material or in the same format, ask them to create something, then what they will do in their quotation would be to add a clause which will say that in order to reduce, reuse, and recycle products, we will charge you an X cost for storing the materials for over a period of a year, and they will be responsible for doing away or basically recycling, reusing the material without and also meeting all the legislation and laws applicable, but the company ends up paying some sort of an additional cost to be able to kind of reduce, reuse, and recycle that material. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. That concept typically kind of expanded into another slide. So what do we mean by reduce, reuse, and recycle? So reduce is sometimes you will see that there's a lot of packaging which is required for doing the events. So for example, if you have a very unique prop or a stand which has been created and that the company plans to reuse for over 3 years because the branding and guidelines and all those things have been implemented and there's a lot of cost which has gone into creating that. So what they want to be able to do is basically reuse that prop again and again in the exhibitions for their own purposes. So in those cases, the idea would be the company which basically creates the prop will then look at the initial start creating packaging or the material which will be used to kind of store it over the year after the event has happened would be something that they will look at, which can be reused, which is something which can be easily produced or easily done away with. The cost of it is less, and to a larger extent, what they will also look at is that in some cases, if it is to be reused or it cannot be reused, you will see that sometimes these agencies, they end up donating, that to charities or for charitable causes. Now, I know for sure that some of the events that I've done and I've been a part of, what we tended to do was when we go across large events, we take a lot of, souvenirs, gifts, and other things which do cost the company to kind of ship it across to the venue. So, for example, I know that I participated in Mobile World Congress for a number of years, and we used to ship across, 5 to 10,000 pens, about 1,000, 1,200 caps, folders, folios, and lots of things. Now, sometimes it is not very cost effective for the company to bring it back. When I was in Glasgow, so I wasn't able to bring them back because the cost of shipping and taking them and then bringing it back probably did not make sense of reusing them again over the years. So what we used to do is things like disposable cups, all the other things which are required, because if it's a 500 people team traveling to to an event which is being showcased for about a week's time, so 3 or 4 days ahead of the event you go in, and then 3 or 4 days after the event is over you come back. So about a 10 to 12 day event, you have a lot of things which the corporate or companies would ship over. So what they tend to do is, in terms of merchandising, if I have to say that as a term, we tend to now don't bring them back. So what we do is we basically tie up with the local charity, and it is seen as a goodwill gesture that you are able to kind of reuse some of that by tying up with a local organization which will use it for charitable purposes. And in some cases, some of the things which are confidential, but obviously we cannot distribute them, things like corporate folios or company information, investor information, they used to be recycled, or there were large paper shredders installed in the FIRA in Barcelona, where companies could come in and shred some of their documents, but the paper which was being shredded was actually being recycled. So a local company there was being employed by the event organizers, which will collect all the paper waste and take it straight away for recycling. So what we do tend to see is that some of these events, when they happen, they have tie-ups with large charities. They also have tie-ups with government and the councils in that location, and they also have tie-up with smaller companies which help facilitate the reduction, reuse, and recycling of waste which is created from such events and the event participants or companies which are participating in those large events. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. Now, some of the other slides focus on that. So lot of large companies, when you look at, they tend to also educate their staff in terms of the recycling process. They want to make sure that the staff which is participating in those events, understand the concept of recycling, understand the concept of waste management, and they tend to kind of, make sure that the staff that they also employ, the staff they also tend to kind of, employ as volunteers would then be also, conscious of the concept of something called recycling. And when you see a lot of the venues in particular which have where the events happen, they tend to do something called color coding, which basically means that sometimes when you have to dispose some of these things like paper or food waste and things like that, they are color coded in terms of, for example, bins that we normally see in our houses as well, which the council collects every week. We have 4 different colors, and the idea of having these color coded bins is that it's easier for people to be able to use, understand, and what are the purposes of reusing. They can clearly see because of the color of the bin. So these kind of signages and different I would say techniques are also involved in order to ensure that people are able to understand visually easily, and then also comply with some of these things which can help reduce waste management typically in the venue. Now, just going to go ahead, Chelsea. Yeah, you want to ask anything?
No.
Okay. Now, the other thing that we want to also understand is when we look at waste management and other bits, what we tend to see is I put together some slides which are self-explanatory, where they talk about things like when you look at stadium events, there are lots of plans, which the stadium and the management team there puts into place in order to ensure that, obviously recycling happens after large events like music concerts, sporting events. So I know for sure that, say, for example, the Wembley Stadium, the Etihad Stadium here, the Manchester United Stadium in Manchester, they are also used as venues by corporate companies for music concerts, for other events which tend to happen from time to time during the lean season, or where the Premier League is off and there are no matches happening. And this helps drive additional revenue income for the venue, but also the event, which tend to happen. They put these plans in place because the main purpose of the venue is to host football matches and things like that. But what they do is when they tend to hire or get these give these venues off for hire to corporate houses and other event organizers, what they tend to do is that they understand that how the venue needs to be kept clean. There is no no one allowed to go onto the turf, and those kind of basic things they come into play. Now, one of the other things that we want to also look at is to understand how, now having said that, we need to reduce, recycle, and look at this concept of reducing waste in general. Sometimes you will see that this does not even happen on a voluntarily basis. So what you will see is sometimes when event organizers take up venues, they have to sign agreements, and these agreements have to be signed between the event organizer and the authorities, but also between the event organizers and the contractors, so that the event organizers clearly specify in the document that what kind of materials can be used for actually creating the the booths and the stalls and the props and everything which is to be used in the creation of the creation of the event or at the venue. Now the idea is they want to be able to differentiate and kind of have different responsibilities for different set of people to manage this. Now this might not be possible primarily if just the organizers define it and take up this as their own responsibility. But in some cases what they have to do is they have to delegate and include this responsibility into contracts, which primarily have to be then adhered by all different types of agencies participating within the the event location. So sometimes you will see that there are specific initiatives which have been created. The mention of few websites that I've done primarily in the slides is primarily to highlight that large events which are happening in different locations. They have asked over the years, and there are some charitable or voluntary organizations which have come up, and they have become kind of a part and parcel of the events management industry. So one such website is stopwaste.org. We'll also see something called Climate Friendly, and we'll also see something called Green Emissions. These websites over the years have come up as charitable organizations which tend to work with large event organizers, and their main aim is to kind of reduce or kind of recycle and reduce wastage, which is primarily coming out of that particular event or event tourism in that city. So they tend to concentrate on recycling of waste, looking at reusing or say for example recycling of most of the material being utilized in the event places. And off late, when we go back about 4 or 5 years back, there is something called the emergence of green energy or carbon offsets. Now this is primarily happening is because some of the venues where where these large exhibitions, conferences, meetings and these kind of things happen, what they've done is, because it's become a permanent venue, it's become a permanent location, in order to reduce the carbon footprint there, most of these venues are now adopting something called the use of solar panels or renewable energy, because some of these event venues utilize a lot of electricity, power, heating, during the days when the events happen. And in some cases, when you look at some of these venues which have become totally permanent venues in that location, and there are loads of things and activities which are happening in terms of events for the year, there the idea is the government is kind of enforcing legislation to ensure that some of these venues and locations now have what you call, renewable source of energy. Now, this is something which has also been put into place by the European Union or the European Parliament, wherein they've said by 2025, all large retail stores, when we look at the likes of Tesco's, Asda's, when you look at, Germany, ATHE, you look at France, Carrefour, most metro in Germany, these large chains have been asked to look at creating, renewable source of energy within the large stores that they have in different locations, different cities. So that means they'll be responsible for recycling. They'll be responsible for generating their own renewable source of energy. And you will, I think it's already started to see that some of the stores have started to install solar panels and other forms of renewable energy through which these stores can actually then reduce energy consumption or wastage of electricity. So sometimes you see that some of the stores are open 24/7 or have late opening hours. You will see that they have invested into something called automatic switching off lights or neon lights, which basically reduce or use less energy. So energy efficient lighting, that's the term. Energy efficient lighting is something which all stores have been asked to install by 2025. Now, this is not related to tourism, but in general, some of these practices are also now being incorporated into large event venues, wherein some of these event venues utilize lots of electricity in terms of gas and electricity, which is in terms of heating as well, and they have been asked to kind of reduce their carbon footprints. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Good stuff. Now let's go into something called let's look at the tasks. So the background there was to primarily understand by those slides three things. One was to look at what kind of impacts tourism, so for example, what kind of an impact the events tourism has on a particular location. What is the significance of sustainability and waste management when we look at events in particular. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So those three things are what we wanted to understand in terms of the broader understanding of the learning outcome, which is understand the impacts of events which it has on a location or tourism. Now let's look at dwelling into and briefly understanding some of the tasks. So the first task basically talks about something called evaluate the range of impacts that events can have on tourism destination. Now here, what we want to be able to do is understand a particular event and what kind of an impact it kind of tends to have on a location. So what I've tried to do is, I'll give you an example, but what I've tried to do essentially here is that we have looked at 4 different types of impacts a event can create on a destination. Now, sometimes you will see, going back to the example of the Grand Prix that we looked at and looking at addressing these 4 points there. Now, if you see Silverstone is still out in the outskirts of London, it's quite far away from London. So it does not have maybe a direct social or a cultural impact in terms of noise pollution or in terms of a lot of people descending into that location for the event, because the event venue itself is slightly outside the main city, and obviously the venue caters to parking and other features which are required during the days when the event is happening, say 2 days or 3 days over the weekend. So it normally starts buzzing around a week before the race is actually happening on the Sunday, but the excitement tends to build up towards Friday, Saturday, when the the trials are happening, and then when they try and attain the pole position, and then Sunday the actual main culmination of the event happens. But if I have to take that same example and put it in context to Monaco, have you heard of Monaco?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you look at the French Riviera and Monaco, which is also one of the venues for the Monaco Grand Prix, there, if this is to be looked at, you will see there's a direct impact on the social, infrastructure there, and also a cultural impact on the city when the event is happening. So because it happens, the Grand Prix happens within the street, within the actually buzzing streets of Monaco, what you tend to see is that everything else tends to come to a standstill or a halt on the day the Grand Prix is happening, because it is a Grand Prix or a car, event which is happening within the streets of the city. So people tend to get affected. You will see that, sometimes people get fed up because what they tend to do is people who live in that particular location have seen the event or the race happening for so many years. They tend to actually go out for 2 or 3 days when the events are actually happening. They tend to kind of rent, their cottages out or their houses out or the flats or the condominiums out, because what they do see is that for the 2-3 days that the event is actually happening, that city turns into a tourist destination, and it's best to get out because it has impacts like, pollution, noise pollution, and, because the normal set of things which are happening in the city, which are day-to-day activities that people are doing, which they go on with on a daily basis, do tend to stop because of this event happening. So it has a social and a cultural impact as far as that is concerned when that particular event or the Grand Prix is happening in Monaco. Correct? You tend to agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's look at what could be defined as the political impact. Now, political impact would be that what we tend to see is that sometimes you will see some events wherein the government, for example, or the local council, or in order to bring in revenue, what they will do is they will tend to do some agreements which are done from an aspect of promoting the event and bringing revenue or economic status to the city. So there is where you will feel sometimes policies or the politicians would look at kind of doing a tie-up, or say play with go along and play with the event organizers to try and get the event to the city, because they see a long-term benefit of the event coming to that venue or that location, and those tend to be political decisions. So here the political impact could be that when it takes into account, the government would then look at giving planning permission to the event organizers to host that kind of an event, and in those cases they might end up creating certain policies which might not go down well with the local community or the local residents in that area. And this would mean that when the government gives those go-aheads and the planning permissions, there is a lot of public disturbance, or public goes through a phase of disturbance because there's a change of infrastructure happening in that location, right? It could be that there are some new things being installed, or, for example, when you look at large venues, you would tend to see that a lot of infrastructure building activity starts, and that tends to lead to, let's put it this way, the outcomes of that activity tend to lead to something like, disturbance, which could be in the terms of traffic, for example. It could be environmental pollution. It could be creation of, for example, certain restrictions on travel because the venue is being made ready, or, the particular event which is going to happen during certain days, certain activities will have restrictions from the members of the public which live in that city. So those tend to be sometimes called the political impacts. Now, these are done primarily by politicians to bring in revenue or raise the economic status of the city, and sometimes the negative output of that could be that a lot of players which get involved in bidding and then look at making that a success in the venue in terms of hosting the event, end up creating unavoidable results, which then tend to kind of do not gel well with what you call the local community in that area. So sometimes these political decisions are not welcomed, are not quite easily welcomed by the general public, and they tend to kind of create media coverage, or there's a lot of negative coverage which tends to happen because the public does not like what decision the government or the local authorities have taken. Is that okay?
Yeah.
The third impact that we look at in this would be an environmental impact, and that would mean that it's quite easy to understand that, for example, if this is a particular venue wherein, let's look at Olympics as an example. Now, when London bid for 2012 Olympics and they won the bid 8 years in advance, what tended to happen was there's a lot of upgrade to the London infrastructure which started to happen in order to bring that event to the city, in order to ensure that the facilitation of the event when it was happening was running smooth. So the creation of the zones on the roads which allowed bikes and cycles to go through during the course of the Olympics when it was happening. Some of the events which were happening, the track and bicycling cycle track events, as I call it, if I can remember correctly, they created restrictions on traffic, and they were in general, environmental impacts for people who were living in that location but could not drive, or because the road suddenly got reduced because there were lots of bike and track events which were happening essentially, outside the stadia or outside the stadium. So in this case, what we see is that sometimes large infrastructure projects involving Olympics, you will see stadias or, state roads, welcome centers, rental facilities, hotels, they start to come up in order to accommodate the, the kind of visitor attractions or tourists which will come into that visitor attraction. And this tends to then, create nuisance from a point of view of, environment for people who are living in that area. So for them, it could be increased traffic jams, crowded car parks, it could be reduction in the size of the road because there's a lot of construction activity happening. And they tend to create something called an environmental impact, which is considered negative for local residents in that location. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. And last but not the least, let's look at, the tourism and economic impacts. Now here, the reason why we look at doing events, and it is quite clear that when we look at doing events, it is one of the largest revenue generators for this sector. So when you look at the tourism activity nationally, internationally, or domestic activity, you will see that sometimes, some decisions are taken because they bring across economic benefits to a location or a city. And that is why, you will see that events are hosted in that location because that location has good transportation links, for example. Now, London, if you see as a venue, the reason why London has the largest events and exhibition venue is because Heathrow is very close to that venue. So a lot of conferences, large conferences, meetings, exhibitions tend to happen in the London area. But economic impact, because it is, what is economic? Economic is, it has a very large impact in terms of monetary terms, both on the city, on the events, and also the, the activity which happens around the event and in the city. So that impact is, it brings in more visitors, more tourists. It creates demand for, say, for example, more services and revenue in general, because it brings business to the local community. But this could be considered a positive impact and a negative impact, and that is something that we'll discuss, in the subsequent tasks. But it tends to create an economic impact. So exhibitions, when they happen just in London, as an industry, brings about £2 to £3 billion in terms of revenue every year just to the City of London. Now, this was something which was classified by the Home Office. If you have seen in the news, sometimes you see a debate happening that a lot of international students which come to the UK for studies should be taken out of immigration figures, because the international student community, which is 1 million strong, which come to the UK every year to study from all over the world, they bring in a revenue benefit of $15 billion equivalent to the UK economy. Now that is something which is an economic impact, because we are talking in terms of very large financial revenues coming in. It's not a few hundreds, not a few thousands, or not a few hundred thousands. It's in millions and billions, and that is where the term economic impact comes in. Is that okay? So
yeah.
This creates employment opportunities. This creates maybe economic opportunities in terms of business to the local communities. So loads of other opportunities which are around investment, promotions, business, hosting, wining, dining, increase in the consumption of food at restaurants during these events, the business going up for the local restaurants in that city, in that location. That tends to then look at the economic impact of tourism. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And the two terms are looked at differently is because the tourism kind of impact happens because of the domestic consumption. So sometimes you will see that we have bank holidays like the one which is coming up on Monday. A lot of people go out, we will do a bit of shopping where there are offers around and things like that. But that is basically domestic consumption. But if this is to happen, like when we look at the bigger festive periods like Christmas, for example, a lot of people from mainland Europe come to UK, or vice versa, from people from here go to mainland Europe. Sometimes you will see, and that tends to be international impact, because you're going in for a short holiday, you're going in to meet your family or your friends, or get together this time at a friend's place for a Christmas, and or for an event like that, and that tends to be the economic impact of the activity. So the tourism is, yes, I have family in France, I have extended family in France, I go there every year, I spend a few weeks during the summer with the family, but the tourism impact is, because I'm going every year, I'm spending some additional income there, I go there for a couple of weeks, I'm essentially British, but I'm going to France, that tends to be tourism. But when you look at the economic impact, yes, because I take across euros and I spend some money there, that brings the economic impact, or the spending that I do in that location during a week or so that I'm there tends to bring revenue to the local restaurants, the shoppers, and other things, and that is what is classified as an economic impact. Is that okay? Now, very briefly, looking at studying the positives and the negatives within these 4 impacts, right? So here, when we look at social and cultural, the positive side of the impact, which is task 2, and the negative is 4.3, which is talking about the negative. So I've clubbed it together into a table, so it's easy to understand. It talks about positive impact being, you have some shared experiences, you get to meet new people, you make new friends. There are, obviously things like, and I gave an example earlier in one of the sessions, was the family wanted to come in to, visit us, but they decided that in 2012 the Olympics are happening, so it's best that we come in, we visit the Olympics, and also visit the family. And they brought their plans a bit forward. So sometimes you'll see culture and tradition and those kind of things also happening, which have positive impact. Now, the positives is easy to understand. Let's look at 1 or 2 negatives. Now, sometimes the negative impact is you see bad behavior, you see a bit of abuse, you see a bit of discrimination happening. And this tends to be the negative impact that we see, of social and cultural events. A simple example would be if you've gone in to watch a match and you support a particular, a team, and that team ends up losing. And if you're in minority there, what you get to see is that you get to see a bit of a bad behavior, or, some sort of disruption during or after the match, which tends to happen. And these are kind of fights you would see between the fans and supporters of different clubs, isn't it? So Liverpool, for example, which is going into the finals of the Champions League, I think there are already some cancellations happening for the fans, because they've already been previously reported to be troublemakers, and they will not be allowed to go to watch the match. So the negative impacts tend to be that if you're too strongly influenced and you have strong thoughts, or let's put it this way, notions about how you need to behave and what you need to do. In some cases, that tends to bring out what you call the negative impact on the society when we look at the effects of events and event management. And an example here would be if you end up taking a football match, or a big event which is happening in the football match or a finals, and that is an easy example for us to classify a positive as well as a negative impact. Now let's look at political and environmental positive and negative impact. Now, political impacts could be, it's easy to understand, improved profile, promotion in terms of investment. Sometimes you will see that the government and politicians also kind of promote social cohesion, which is basically bringing together, if it's a multi-diverse community in a particular location, they say that having those kind of events, or sometimes celebrations of those events wherein different communities take part, can help in some sort of cohesion. And also from time to time you will see that there is a lot of development of skills which most of the local councils end up promoting. When we look at some of the the parades which tend to happen, and there the idea is they want to look at showcasing the skills of the public, or they want to give opportunities to the members of the public in order to be able to develop skills. And some of these projects could be funded from a point of view of promoting excellence, or promoting the development of those skills. The negative impact tend to be that obviously there are risks of certain failures which is sometimes some of the events which are promoted by the government do not create traction with the mass public or do not resonate in terms of opinion with the mass public. You will see that it tends to create a bit of, failed investment. You will see sometimes in the news that, you do tend to hear that, okay, the investment done by the government did not right. So example that I would say is, the referendum which happened just before the Brexit happened, the referendum for us to be choice. That referendum costed the government £152 million to run the referendum campaign. So when you look at that, a lot of politicians and a lot of people now feel as that, one, the referendum should have never happened. Second, this money could have been used, in a better, for a better cause than on the money which was spent by, the politicians on talking about, the benefits of, Brexit, or the opposite, which is in terms of staying in the European Union. So there was, I don't know whether you recall, there was a leaflet which the government had done, and that was sent across to all homes, which talked about the benefits and the losses of, or the disadvantages of Brexit. And that was a government-created, leaflet which went across, and that costed $26 million, or £26 million essentially for circulation. Now that was, even after the Tory government, David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister at that point in time, they decided to go ahead with that, educate the public about the, let's say, the failures, or basically, the negative effects of Brexit. That did not result in, the Brexit referendum not happening, and also Britain leaving the EU, or at least preparing to leave the EU. So that was a big risk that they had to take, and obviously, even after taking that risk, it did not get the results which it expected. So this is an example of, it was a big event, in the British democracy, because I think, referendums like these have never happened before. But once it was given, a lot of people took hold of it and obviously voted against or for it. And what we see is that, even in spite of the large political will, they were not able to prevent, this from happening. We are now approaching Brexit. So there are some events, sometimes you will see, which will have political impacts, positive and negative. Last but not the least, let's look at environmental, easy to understand. You look at positives and negatives. Sometimes you will see that, there is increased awareness because of some of these events which are happening, and some charities, voluntary organizations will campaign for it, saying that, okay, we need to increase awareness so that even if they go ahead, it does not have any detrimental or negative impact, in the environment. But on the other side, what we do get to see sometimes is that it creates pollution even after putting in so much legislation, controls in place, traffic congestion, noise disturbances, things like that, which tend to happen. And those are the negative effects of, the environmental as a factor. And then positive and negatives of tourism and economic activity. Okay. So what we want to be able to do is now look at, concluding. So at the end, what I've done is covered some of these tasks to give you an idea in terms of what needs to be covered when you do the assignment. Now, what I'm also going to do is send you a bit of a handout, which, if you see, which I've created, and that is this handout, which, one second. And this particular handout, which I've created, which basically would give you some, kind of detail into understanding these 4 factors, which, impact on event in particular, different types of impacts. So I've listed them out as social and cultural, political, environmental, and obviously, tourism and economic impacts. Okay?
Yes, thank you.
Good stuff. So now with this, I think what we've done is we've brought this to a bit of a conclusion in terms of this particular unit. And if you start looking at maybe some of the tasks, and then start a draft assignment and send it over, and what we can do is obviously, if there are areas that I do feel that need a bit of attention, I'll try and create some handouts which I can send across to you, from time to time.
Yeah. Do we, you mentioned about picking an event to use as our unit example.
Yes.
Do we have to pick a bigger or be a small event, or should it just be an event of interest to us?
I think it's a good question that you asked. I think what I would suggest in this case would be to apply a bit of judgment when you read some of the tasks to be able to address those with the kind of event that you pick up. Now, picking a big event would give you a lot of scope, because that would mean that you will be able to cover all the tasks and relate them to the various aspects. Like, for example, if you look at LO3, it will be wise for you to pick up an event which is a large event, because it then would classify or fall into a classification of MICE if you pick up a conference exhibition. On the other hand, if you pick up a small event, some of the bits that you will be required to be covered in LO1 and 2 will be easily covered, because you will be able to bring in and explain that event much more in relation to the theoretical aspects in the learning outcome 1 and 2. But it's really up to you. I think you can have 1, 2, depending on, you could also look at maybe just stitching the examples or including them as examples once you complete the task. So the first one says classify small, large, hallmark and mega events. So here basically you're listing all the types of events which are there and putting in maybe 2, 3 lines just to explain each of the event. You're not required to cover all the 20 types which I showed you on that website, just maybe a couple of in terms of categories. So here you don't need an event in particular. The second one, when it says describe the characteristic of each kind of event, again the same task being expanded into 1.2, and the categories that you could choose: personal events, corporate events, those kind of wedding events, and those within the personal events you can choose one category to kind of explain that in a bit more detail. In the third one, I've given a bit of a handout which kind of explains the the connection between tourism, hospitality, and event management. I think your example of event would actually start to follow through, I would say, in terms of 2.1, and then basically I would say a bit of 3.1 and 4.1 and 4.2 and 4.3. So depends. I think you should be able to pick up an event that you like, something that you are something that you know and out about, you've been to, and then that's something for you to easily bring into explaining in your own words when you start doing the tasks.
Okay, brilliant.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is obviously just quickly looking at for tomorrow in terms of what do we have, for our schedule. Are we starting the next unit tomorrow?
Yes, at 1 o'clock.
Right. Okay. I'm conscious of the fact that obviously we are planning, a graduation survey. So what I want to be able to do is try and finish that unit with you guys towards within June rather. So we'll quick look. Right. Okay. So we will start this unit. Yeah, that's fine. We'll start this unit for tomorrow, and then you've got a week's time if you are able to turn that around. In the meanwhile, I think, have you received the feedback from? I haven't sent any for you so far. Have you received anything from Phil?
I received a little bit of feedback on my finance unit, and then he said he was gonna look at my other 2 units, but I haven't had feedback from him yet.
Right. Okay, that's fine. So I think those are the things that we'll try and get to you by Monday or Tuesday morning, because I think 2 or 3 assignments what we want to be able to do is get that in, and once they are in, you have a week or 10 days to be able to complete this one in terms of drafts. We can, we'll continue with the next unit, but in the meanwhile, you can start doing up this draft. Put the copy of this presentation and also, the the handout that I've created on Moodle just after the session. Okay, brilliant. Thanks a lot for this, Chelsea, and I'll speak to you